like how we frame them. Just a couple more minutes. Does anyone have any questions about, I think we need to talk about, we've talked about it, and hopefully you've seen that mini video I made on your presentations. Is anyone like worried, looking forward to it? Who's ready to go? Who could do it today? Sea of black faces. Oh, Lord. Lachlan's saying no. That's fine. I'm going to make some little mini videos tomorrow and hopefully upload them in the afternoon, kind of discussing some of the more ornate essay questions. So hopefully that will give you something to feed off. A few people have sent through emails with questions about, you know, am I heading in the right direction with this thesis statement? And I have got back to you, like sometimes it can take a little while, I'm sorry about that, kind of saying, you know, yeah, that's the right direction. And you could kind of ask this question, you could ask that question, and maybe you want to focus on these areas in the text. So yeah, if you're kind of wondering like, where do I focus on? I've got my argument. I may be able to shed some light there because I may be a generalized fool, but I've read the novels kind of numerous times. So I have a fairly good knowledge of them. So yeah, do send through questions if you have them. I know a lot of kind of people, academics don't like getting them, but I think that's your job in a way, is to make sure you guys know what you're doing and you're kind of ready to go in terms of your long essays. Hi, Caitlin. Generally, kind of, I don't think you should worry too much about your essay plan. You should, of course, do as much work on it as you can, but your essay plan is to kind of start thinking and start working and start researching on your essay, which is like the main thing for most literary studies units. We want to kind of get you reading text, thinking about text, and then arguing about text and kind of developing your argumentative skills via the essay, which is kind of very central to the Western idea of argument and rhetoric. How can I put forward my viewpoints upon the world? How can I convince you that the world is such with my mini argument, this thing called the essay? What's the time? 6:07. I better get the ball rolling. So today, of course, we're going to be looking at the test of the D'Urbervilles. I don't know. I feel like sometimes I'm going to share the screen. I might just check the chat. Amber agrees 100%. Is this you agreeing with Jamie, who says, hey, everyone? Or is that you? Who are you agreeing with, Amber? I'm just curious.
I was agreeing with Renz when they were saying that it was their favorite.
Oh, yeah, maybe that's a good way to start, is not actually me ranting on about Thomas Hardy, his like dates and his moustache and kind of how short he was and how tall he was. Ren raises a good question. So before I share the screen, I might just ask, Ren's mentioned that he thinks this was kind of one of the most interesting novels, and that's perhaps why he selected it. Does anyone agree, disagree? Amber does. Why do you think it's an important novel, Amber?
Lots of reasons. I think I appreciate something that is different for its time, like I appreciated Wuthering Heights. And I think the social narrative is probably my favorite out of all of the books. And just the way that Hardy writes also appeals to me the most out of all three, or all four. I haven't read Lady Chatterley's Lover, so I can't really speak to that yet. But yeah, I like the way that it's written. I think I appreciate the naturalism aspects because it's, like you said, like it really is beautiful in some points.
Yeah, it is very beautiful.
Yeah.
So social narrative aspect, maybe I know, Jamie, if I can kind of ask you, because I know you're writing, I'm pretty sure you're going to write your essay on Tess. You may change your mind between now and then. When you sent me an email a while back saying kind of, I definitely think it's a tragedy. I think you were saying this, but I don't see how it's a romance. Um, is that right? Like, why? What appealed to you about Tess?
Yeah, I definitely think it's a tragedy, and maybe that comes under romance. I'm not quite sure. I think the ending, and I don't want to spoil it for anyone, but that made me hate it because I hate the ending, and it's not happy, and it's just awful. Um, but yeah, I definitely think it's a tragedy. Sorry, what was your question?
No, no, we would. I was just asking, like, yeah, you raised a good question in pointing out that it is a tragedy. Um, it's definitely a tragedy, and is what differentiates romance from tragedy? That's a really big question. But I would say that a lot of great literature, what it does when you break it down, is often kind of seminal. Get rid of that word. Stop using it, Chris. A lot of kind of cutting edge literature will combine narrative structures to create some synthesis of something new. For instance, if you think of Romanticism and William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, they created the lyrical ballads. They kind of united lyrical poetry with traditional ballad stories that once belonged to kind of folk culture, and they united them together. But in terms of Tess being a romantic tragedy, I might throw that out. Did anyone kind of see it more as a tragedy than a romance? I mean, Olivia, Renz. Hmm. One way of thinking about it, and kind of anyone kind of may want to take this up in their essays, is to what extent is Tess a tragedy about the failings of romance? Because in one respect, I do think Tess is a romance, but it's a romance that's kind of engineered to arrive at tragedy. And I think we'll talk a little bit about how tragedy kind of differs significantly from romance in terms of narrative structures. Of course, romance has a happy ending, tragedy doesn't, and both kind of exist for different purposes. Like if you go back to ancient Greece and look at the tragedies there, you find that often, or even think of Shakespearean tragedies, often those tragedies are designed to either provoke moral reflection about why society is so vexed, and to resist the idea of resolving social problems magically, which in reality require us to make significant changes if we are going to resolve them. But a lot of kind of anthropologists in particular have looked at tragedy, and they've looked at the way tragedy was very much connected to the ritual of sacrifice. Tragedies often have protagonists who get sacrificed to society in the same way that a lot of basic religious rituals will depend upon the sacrifice of some individual to propitiate some higher deity. So there may be a ritualistic relationship between the narrative of tragedy and the narrative kind of human of sacrifice. But
I just
yeah,
had,
I kind of Amber, go.
I just had one question about the book. I haven't like fully finished, but I do know the ending in that. But I'm just a bit confused about the religion within it. I know there's really strong religions, but uh, is it Christianity and paganism? Are they the two religions that run through it? I'm not
Yeah.
like well versed in religion, but I know it's heavy in there.
Um, I I definitely think there's a lot of what you would call folk anthropology that Hardy's doing. I think we'll discuss this a little bit later when we look at Fraser's The Golden Bow. For instance, if you look at the very beginning of Tess, where they all come in carrying willow wands at the beginning of spring, kind of Hardy seems to be a bit anthropological in the sense that he's studying this little rural folk community in Britain, and he's showing how they're unconsciously reproducing ancient ritualistic practices that they probably don't even know what they're doing. And that's to a certain extent some of the what you'd call paganism or kind of pre-Christian spirituality that exists in all of the little ritual practices that people get up to. In this novel, for instance, Angel Clare, on the night of their wedding, he goes out and gets some mistletoe, I believe, and hangs it up on the wall, which once again is kind of ties back to kind of pre-Christian religious beliefs. I think there's also a lot of mention to these mythical kind of, I didn't even know really if Druids existed, these kind of Celtic priest type figures, but there's a whole lot of kind of what you'd call pre-Christian kind of, I don't know if you call it paganism, but pre-Christian pantheism existing. And you definitely see that when the novel ends at Stonehenge, but you also see it kind of through various forms of representation, particularly Angel. If you look at the way Angel views Tess, he views her as like this kind of pagan embodiment of spring, which I guess is very romantic and nice. But of course, you know, in a lot of these pagan rituals, often those romantic embodiments of spring would often get sacrificed to propitiate some higher deity. So that, to answer your question, Amber, and it's a very hard question to answer, there is a whole lot of kind of cultural anthropology going on, kind of embedded in Test of the D'Urbervilles, which you don't see in Pride and Prejudice. You do see a lot of sociology in Pride and Prejudice, but you don't see basically Hardy kind of representing folk culture and cultural practices that the people are performing. And they don't actually, I don't think they know what they're doing in terms of why they're doing it. But in terms of Christianity, the main forms of Christianity we're dealing here in Britain during this period is Anglicanism and its various stratifications. So I'm pretty sure Angel's father belongs to what's called a kind of broad or low church approach to Christianity, not baptism or not Methodism, but an open church approach to kind of allowing everyone to come into church on the weekend. And then he gives kind of a sermon and kind of preaches to them. Whereas in Britain at the time, you had kind of all of these various denominations that kind of, the way they differed in a sense was you had Anglicanism, which kind of was instituted after King Henry VIII said, I'm sick of the Catholic Church, we're going to create our own Church of England and I'll be the head of state. Anglicanism's still around today. The way it differs from the various denominations that you see in Tess, but kind of you see in British religion kind of from the period onwards, is Anglicanism tends to be very ritualistic. They still wear kind of religious garb and they still do a lot of rituals. And a lot of people who kind of follow that might be called high Anglicans. They believe in all of that ritual, traditional practice that goes on kind of on Sunday. Whereas someone like Angel's father, who is a very pious man, he's very much more interested in reading the Bible and making sure people understand the Bible. And the ritualistic practices don't matter too much. But yeah, that's a really great and hard question to answer, Amber, because it's there's so much going on in the novel in terms of paganism, in terms of pre-Christian kind of ritualistic behavior and Christianity. And that would be a great essay question to look at in terms of how they may be gendered.
Yeah, I was thinking of introducing it, but I just don't know that much about it. So I wanted to make sure it was an important aspect and I wasn't just kind of imagining it. It just felt like it kept popping up so much that you can't really not talk about it.
No. And one of the really things I love, I think Renz is saying, do you agree here? You're interested in this as well?
I think most likely I'm going to base my essay on Test of the D'Urbervilles as well. So,
Well, I look forward to reading what you guys kind of come up with there. It is like a huge topic, but try and like focus on something that really interests you because you'll enjoy writing it in that respect. But yes, Amber, there's a whole lot going on in Test of the D'Urbervilles in terms of cultural anthropology. And I think kind of it speaks to the time because anthropology is a science and a lot of kind of new social sciences were kind of getting instituted and invented during this period, kind of came of age when Thomas Hardy was writing Test of the D'Urbervilles, and Thomas Hardy was reading quite widely, a bit like Emily Bronte, who read a book called Berwick's History of British Birds. And if you read Wuthering Heights, you find, hey, there's all of these birds here. Nally knows all about these different birds. Kind of clearly Emily Bronte's incorporated that text into her own novel, clearly Thomas Hardy's starting to incorporate a lot of cultural anthropology into his understandings of what's going on in the English novel. Yeah, I want to get into our session today, but I also want to just, kind of continue on Renz's point. Renz saying that this is a great novel. I've really enjoyed it. Has anyone else kind of enjoyed it, but maybe found it a bit challenging? I remember when I first tried to read Tess, it was quite challenging. Okay.
I'm liking it more
Jamie?
than Pride and Prejudice.
Oh, really? That's good. Jamie, you've got thumbs up. Do you find it challenging? I think it's fair to say it's a pretty challenging novel.
Yeah, I think it's a great novel and challenging in that it evokes a lot of emotion. Like while I'm reading it, my jaw is just like on the floor of some of the things that are in there. But I think that makes it a great novel, but not an easy read either.
No, I think Tess is a novel that you could probably cry while reading in a few passages. Wuthering Heights, maybe you could cry while reading it. Pride and Prejudice, and I do emotions in the sense of sympathy, but also perhaps hatred. Is there a character that just you can't stand? Or no? Caitlin?
Yeah, I was just going to say what Jamie was going to say in the chat. It's Alec.
Is he like just, don't you just wish he could
Oh my
jump
gosh.
on Wuthering Heights? Alex is a complete dog. Oh, damn it, Renz. He can't help it. He was born bad. He'll live bad and he'll probably die bad.
Even dogs are better. Let's be real.
He's, he is a very curious villain. And we'll look a lot at him, I think, next week on Wednesday when it comes to, the way he's kind of demonic. He becomes kind of redolent of Satan by the end of the novel. He's snake-like. But there's also a profound kind of graphic form of realism when it comes to Alec. He's very well portrayed. I don't know if there's much comedy to him, but I do think you're kind of designed to kind of hate him in a profound way, particularly the way he looks at people and women in particular. Kind of is very, very creepy and very, very disturbing. It's a shame that Alec's mother was blind because clearly something needed to be done there. I kind of want to keep the conversation going rather than kind of jump into my slides. Those of you who decided, hey, I don't have the time, did any of you check out Roman Polanski's Tess of the D'Urbervilles?
I watched it today.
What did you think, Olivia?
I often find it really difficult to watch these kind of old-fashioned movies because I just find that they jump from like timeline to timeline, like kind of like spoiler alert, but all of a sudden she had a kid and I'm like, oh, okay. Like it just was like very like sudden. So I find it a bit jolting and a bit jarring. But other than that, I thought it was all right.
That's an interesting point Olivia makes about how it just jumps from Tess having no child to having a child. I think Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale was one of the first novels in English to actually depict a woman giving birth. You don't actually ever really see women giving birth in literature, which is quite bizarre when you think about it, because we were all born. So why isn't it being represented? Great question to get to the bottom of, and Thomas Hardy definitely doesn't represent people giving birth. Did anyone else check out the adaptation or have a look at the more recent BBC one? It's definitely worth having a look at. Did anyone kind of decide not to watch it because of Roman Polanski? Does anyone not know who Roman Polanski is?
Yeah, I didn't watch it for that reason.
Yeah, he's a bit. Yeah, some people just decide not to watch it for that reason, and that's understandable. I don't know if I have to kind of warn you that some of the content we'll be talking about, probably not in the first half of today's session, but in the second half of today's session and definitely on Wednesday's session, yeah, I will warn you that some of the discussion may be distressing, but I will kind of bring that up when we start to talk about that. And if you don't want to kind of participate, that's perfectly fine in that respect. Yeah, but I do recommend watching one of the adaptions. There's two choices there. I do believe there's another adaptation, but I couldn't quite find that on, yeah, ClickView seems to be the only one that kind of I can really kind of gather and conjure up. But I do look forward, it's going to be good to see and read the essays on Tess of the D'Urbervilles. It seems to be becoming a more and more popular novel, which is good, because there's been a move kind of, and I'll get to it in a moment, when it comes to which Thomas Hardy novel perhaps we should set as reading and perhaps getting rid of Thomas Hardy. And every time I think this happens, Tess kind of crawls up and says, no, you can't get rid of me. My story is too important. There's no other story, because Thomas Hardy kind of did write a lot of more successful romances that were more appreciated during his period by kind of society at large, whereas Tess, a bit like Wuthering Heights, provoked a lot of negative feedback. You guys seeing my little session overview here?
Yep.
Tess in the graveyard. This is the first session of Tess. What are we going to do? I'm hopefully not going to bore you too much with a story about Thomas Hardy's background, but I think just a little kind of overview of who he was, where he came from, could be helpful. We'll look at some of the context to do with Tess, because we're kind of moving away from kind of particularly kind of the 18th, early 19th century, the Victorian period, and moving towards the modern early 20th century. I mean, this is a late Fin de Siecle novel written in 1891. So we're going to look at kind of context like modernization, we'll look at natural selection, and we'll look at the anthropology of the romance as it relates to Tess of the D'Urbervilles. Then we'll probably have a break, and I've got a reading of an essay written by Thomas Hardy on censorship, because as some of you will know, there is an event in Tess that doesn't get represented. Thomas Hardy seems to be very good at representing reality in a profound fashion. He pretty much knows all about the flora and fauna of the whole British countryside, and often when he sees a bird, he can imagine what the bird is thinking and where the birds come from. But when it comes to a certain event, it can't get represented. So bearing that in mind, I've got a short essay that Thomas Hardy wrote about censorship, and in a way, I'll ask some questions about this short reading, get you guys to read it. In a way, it's really about kind of the idea of getting some rating systems into culture, because we're talking about a period when there was no MA15, there was no R-rated, there was no PG, there was no general viewing, there was none of that. There was just literature in the bookshop, and you could go and pick it up. Then at the very end, as we kind of transition from this session to next week's session, when we look kind of at the central kind of issues in Tess, I want to play you a short film based on an exhibition that was kind of held a while back at the Foundling Museum in Britain about this concept that we haven't somewhat talked about of the fallen woman that became very prevalent in the Victorian period. We kind of got glimpses of this kind of representation of the fallen woman, a woman who falls morally, socially, and apparently sexually in Victorian society. We kind of got glimpses of what the fallen woman may have meant in terms of Lydia Bennet and the way she's kind of frowned upon for eloping with Wickham. And we've kind of also got a little bit of that in terms of Isabella Linton when she elopes with Heathcliff. But we need to kind of look at that because it was a central theme in the back of kind of in the background or in the world of Thomas Hardy. Some of you may be a little bit lost. I just want to kind of reconnoitre, make sure everyone knows where we are and where we're going. So we are finishing, or we finished Wuthering Heights, and we're starting on Tess of the D'Urbervilles. those of you, hopefully, kind of you'll be finishing this novel by the end of the weekend. We'll be looking and talking about Thomas Hardy today, and we'll be looking at the context in which he wrote. We'll be looking a bit at censorship in the novel in the 1890s. And of course, censorship will become very important when we look at Lady Chatterley's Lover, because that was a novel that was banned for about 60 odd years. And there was a big controversial trial in the 1960s that really kind of changed the way censorship laws operated in Great Britain, but then in the world more broadly. We'll look at some themes that make Tess a very important book, very kind of relevant book. A lot of the problems, although they're not so kind of stark and severe, nevertheless still persist to day. On Monday, sorry, that should be on Wednesday, of course, because on Monday we all present our essay plans. We'll look at aspects of romance and realism. I think I might want to just give you some little narrative story about, where we've been and where we're going. So we've come a long way since Jane Austen. Pride and Prejudice was published in Regency Britain in 1813. The ideology of Pride and Prejudice seemed to be grounded in a critique of marriage and over-idealistic constraints placed on middle-class femininity. The questions it asked concerned freedom of choice, how to critique social judgments of women's mobility, and issues of perception, the way we see the world. As literature, Austen's novel presents us with a romance about the achievability of a socially just world. Sorry, I might be repeating myself here, but often the repetition can help. And we looked at Wuthering Heights, which was published kind of deep into the Victorian period, or in the early to mid-Victorian period. While interested in exploring problems of class and gender, the ideology of the novel seems much more ambiguous. We saw that in the reviews, the negative reviews of Wuthering Heights. We also see that in the denouement, or the conclusion of Wuthering Heights. By Bronte's time, society began to really discuss inequalities to do with class and gender. This was called the woman question. It's a very bizarre sounding term today, but that's what they called it. They called it the woman question. As literature, Bronte's novel kind of, I suggested, speaks to a type of art more interested in positioning itself outside or above the social body, a higher type of literature or art. And we'll kind of return to this when we look at modernism and D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lover, which once again doesn't really seem to care too much about the social conventions of the modern world, although that's kind of not true. Lawrence is more interested in making sure you as an individual are kind of happy in yourself and in your life. Now let's turn to Tess. Tess was published in 1891. By this time, Victorian society had continued to modernise, careers had expanded, but many problems Austen was writing about, for example, the fallen woman, remained in place and only seemed to have got worse. And that's kind of something I tried to emphasise when I talked about the issue of question in Wuthering Heights is the Regency period, the period of Romanticism, was a very hopeful moment in the history of the West, and was a hopeful moment in terms of things becoming more progressive and more pluralistic and open. And then you get to the Victorian period, and although technology and kind of infrastructure modernizes, kind of certain issues to do with rights seem to go a little bit backwards. What Hardy, I think, will seem to want to do in Tess is draw into what has been missing in romance. As Jamie and a few others kind of came to the agreement that we're looking at a tragedy here, nonetheless, it is kind of structured as a type of romance. There are kind of a failed romance at the very center of Tess. And I think, in a way, kind of one of the issues that we haven't really discussed, and I'm sorry if I'm sounding a bit vulgar here, is this issue of sex and sexual representation in romance, because lo and behold, Freud, a lot of other people, Charles Darwin came along and said, sex seems to be pretty central to kind of human nature, which raises the question, where does it go? Where does sex go in Pride and Prejudice? I don't know, you can really look at that novel quite closely, and you can find certain pillars and structures that seem a bit phallic, and certain flowing lakes that may kind of infer certain kind of things. But if you actually look at the text close, it's something that doesn't really want to be spoken about. Take, for instance, this passage at the very end. Elizabeth, she's been, I don't know, smooching perhaps behind the bushes with Darcy, and she gets back and Jane is like, "My dear Lizzie, where can you have been walking to?" She had only to say in reply that she had wandered about till she was beyond her own knowledge. I actually don't mind this. Like, I don't mind reading this and not kind of like it's left kind of it's not too important, but it nevertheless raises the question, they just walk around holding hands, and is this the nature of romance in this period? How do the children come? Where do they come from? Are they found in the pumpkin nest? I don't know, because Austen doesn't really seem to be kind of too intent on kind of representing kind of those aspects in any kind of elusive metaphorical way. She coloured as she spoke, but neither that nor anything else awakened a suspicion of the truth. In Wuthering Heights, it is a kind of bodice-ripping romance, but again, although you have certain erotic aspects to the novel, to the romance, sublimated, embodied in certain kind of styles of representation, whether it be the vampire, the Gothic Heathcliff, the closest we come to it is a passage when Heathcliff comes in and embraces Cathy while she's very sick. An instant they held asunder, and then how they met I hardly saw, but Catherine made a spring and he caught her, and they were locked in an embrace from which I thought my mistress would never be released alive. In fact, to my eyes, she seemed directly insensible. He flung himself into the nearest seat, and on my approaching hurriedly to ascertain if she had fainted, he gnashed at me and foamed like a mad dog, and gathered her to him with greedy jealousy. I did not feel as if I were in the company of a creature of my own species. Is this somewhat erotic or not at all? Is this Nally kind of representing adultery by sublimating it into some weird Gothic kind of animalistic passion?
Yeah, I think so.
Did anyone think that there was a lot of passion in Wuthering Heights, and that's why all the beasties kind of came into the narrative? Amber's got thumbs up. I do think it's a very passionate novel. But there again, like there's kind of everything seems to be sublimated, which is it's great. It's quite beautiful as well. That's one of the things great art does, is it sublimates sexuality and produces kind of fine works of art. Bearing this in mind, and I think it's worthwhile mentioning, because if you read Tess closely, you'll notice there's a passage when Tess, after encountering Alec, coming back after the first phase, she has an argument with her mother about what happened there. And the argument often turns to actual novels. And Tess goes, if only I had access to literature that would tell me about someone like Alec, maybe then I would have known. So questions Hardy seems to want to talk about or ask in Tess is, why are certain behaviours not being represented clearly, or at all for that matter? Why does Lydia and Wickham elope and off they go and everything's inferred? Same with Heathcliff and Cathy, but also Heathcliff and Isabella. Why is it all inferred? How does this relate to social problems? A central social problem, I would say, and I hate to say it, but it's the big problem of patriarchy. It's a very central problem in all of the novels we've looked at. Another big problem that I don't know if we've really touched upon, but I think we have. Were there double standards when it came to sexuality in Pride and Prejudice, in terms of, like, George Wickham seems to have been getting around the countryside of Britain, doing whatever he liked. Were those same standards applied to women? For example, when Mr. Collins rocks up at Longbourn with his Bible and his kind of solemn condemning gaze, does he say anything about Wickham after the elopement's been discovered?
Not particularly. It's all about Lydia.
Yeah, it's just there's just this assumption that, hey, the dudes, when they're out and kind of doing stuff, you know, boys will be boys or something like that. It's just there's this implication that we don't need to moralize here. And it's very bizarre because in a way Wickham's this social problem that Darcy goes around cleaning up. And he seems to make sure, you know, stay away from my little sister, but yeah, go to another county. I don't want to see or hear of you, you roue, you rake, but just, yeah, keep away, kind of in that respect. It's not so kind of, it's inferred in that respect. Another question Hardy seems to want to ask is, what is the purpose of romance? So we've been reading romance novels. Hardy wants to really Hardy's writing literature, he's writing novels, and a bit like Jane Austen, I think Dana mentioned this when she said a while back, she said maybe Austen knows that there's a social contract and she has to write a novel in a certain fashion if it's to be published and to be received well. Hardy kind of had to do this as well. We'll see this in a moment with some of his other novels. Some were very successful. When we get to Tess, Hardy's made some money and he doesn't need to worry about finances too much. And he seems to be like, I have some freedom now. I want to ask this question. What is the purpose of the romance? Where does the romance come from? And also, is this thing we call the romance a healthy narrative structure kind of to be telling? And I think that kind of ties into where we kind of see the romance in Tess becoming a tragedy, because he does seem to have an answer to kind of what he sees as some of the failings of romance. He also wants to ask this very fundamental question that only people try to answer when it comes to literature. I mean, psychologists probably do it quite a lot, and they probably get their little mice and put them in labyrinths and watch them chew each other to death. But literature does it much more differently, and that is, you know, why do people kill? But why do women kill? Because women during this period have been gendered to be kind of maternalistic and kind. What's going on there? Because that seems to be a very kind of big question to answer. And anyone wanting to write a novel, try and answer that question, and you'll probably either get arrested, put in jail, or write a bestseller. So who was this chap called Thomas Hardy? I kind of feel like any of you guys could have been Thomas Hardy. And I don't want to say, you know, maybe Olivia, you might be of the gentry. Maybe Lance may have some aristocratic heritage. Lance sounds like a Lancelot. Maybe he goes way back to the 13th century, the Duchy de Boulogne, and, you know, he's got some heritage in the gentry. But I do think kind of any of us could have been, economically speaking, Thomas Hardy in terms of our background. Thomas Hardy came from kind of what we would call an upwardly mobile working tradesman class background, born in 1840 at the beginning of the Hungry 40s in rural Dorset in the southwest of England. Down here, I think Dorset's the capital. No, I think Dorsetshire is the capital of Dorset, not far away from Hampshire. You'll remember, of course, Emily Bronte from all the way up here in Yorkshire. Thomas Hardy's father, who's also, his name was Thomas Hardy, and his father before him was named Thomas Hardy. They just like to name their children Thomas Hardy, was a stone mason or a stone builder. He was also a musician, and kind of they'd travel around on the weekends playing songs. Thomas Hardy's mother was a servant, not at all perhaps like Hill in Pride and Prejudice, who's kind of getting around helping out the Bennet sisters. Not at all unlike Nellie Dean as well. Apparently, a lot of the intellectual side of Thomas Hardy growing up came from his mother. His mother wanted Thomas to be something better in life, so she kind of inculcated him in literature and whatnot. One of the interesting things about Thomas Hardy that may interest you is he was incredibly small. He was a very little person. And he was born into a working class family, but because he was so small, when he was born, they actually thought he was dead because the baby was so small, they put the baby down and said, oh, it's dead. And then suddenly it came back to life. But growing up, Thomas Hardy, I think he was about 5'2" or something. He was a little taller than Charlotte Bronte, who was about the size of an emperor penguin, if that gives you some scale. We're talking about very small people. Like, a lot of you don't realize this, but we're getting taller and taller. We're talking about a period, the Hungry 40s, when a lot of people didn't have much food to eat, so people aren't that big. Growing up, Hardy kind of lived around and saw, but did not directly experience rural poverty. There was a kid that lived in Dorset near Thomas Hardy who starved to death. Thomas Hardy kind of knew a child that basically starved to death. He was trying to support his family, and the kid just said, I'll try and live off eating turnips or some type of kind of vegetable, and the poor child starved to death. So we're talking about a time it wasn't a good time to be alive in the 1840s. What was somewhat unique to Hardy, and it was probably tied to his small demeanor, was his family decided that because he was so small, we're going to get him educated. And kind of that's what happened. He kind of got a primary, a secondary education. And I think he kind of also worked as a bit of a tutor or a teacher for a short while in the 1850s. And then like the next move for him was to become an architect, because his father was a stonemaster builder, kind of let's move up in society a little bit, and he'd become an architect. Privately, however, kind of Hardy kind of wanted to be a writer. He met this aristocratic dude called Horace Mule, who actually ended up killing himself tragically. But Horace kind of took Hardy under his wing and kind of introduced him to kind of all of the trends going on at the time, and he kind of set Thomas Hardy up kind of to become more than what kind of he could be in terms of his historical background. Do you think Thomas Hardy went to university? Anyone want to take a guess?
Maybe no.
Maybe no. Yeah, no. Thomas Hardy wanted to go to university. When he was like in high school, he studied so hard. He kind of was the dux in his class. He did so much work. But there was just no chance of him going on to university, because to go to university during this period cost an incredible amount of money. And a lot of the people he met at the time also encouraged him not to go to university. They said, you're a working class person. You shouldn't go to university. You may be intelligent, but you kind of belong to the middle class. That's probably what you should aspire to. This is something Thomas Hardy writes about in his book, Jude the Obscure, which was, if Renz and I think a few others were mentioning this, Jamie mentions that Tess made, it's a very evocative novel. Jude the Obscure was such a novel that people would burn it after reading it, because it was such an angry novel. In fact, the first novel Thomas Hardy tried to write in 1862 was called The Poor Man and the Lady. And the publishers, a bit like Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, recognized that, hey, this is a really good novel, but they rejected publishing it because it was just seen as too angry and too antagonistic towards the social class system in Great Britain at this time. So he basically kind of put that book aside because it would never get published, because it was too much of like an angry man poem. And kind of he got told by the publishers, hey, why don't you write like a romance or something? And that's exactly what he did. He published kind of another kind of novel called Desperate Remedies, which was a little bit of a success, but then he published kind of what became kind of his most famous and celebrated novel while he was alive, Far from the Madding Crowd. Has anyone heard of Far from the Madding Crowd? There was a recent adaptation, and Olivia said she doesn't like adaptations too much because they seem to flip through things. Alana?
Yeah, I was just saying I've heard of it. It's one of my favorite books and movie adaptations.
Yeah,
Well done.
yeah.
I love it.
Yeah, it's a very, very beautiful book. And the adaptation recently made is definitely worth watching. I might actually put it up on Collaborate as a reward for you guys. I know it's not a fantastic reward, but I'm sure Alana will second this. It's one of the finest romance novels probably written in the 19th century. And that's part of the tragedy of this course is Far From the Madding Crowd is probably an exemplum of the romance novel. Maybe Pride and Prejudice is probably kind of a bit more iconic, but Far From the Madding Crowd is very progressive and a very moving novel. And there's always a push to set Far From the Madding Crowd as the text. But as you probably know, kind of as Alana might know, because she's maybe had a look at Tess or read Tess as well as Far From the Madding Crowd, Tess doesn't make you feel very good at the end, whereas Far From the Madding Crowd certainly does. It's a very beautiful novel. I would recommend it if you enjoyed reading Tess. Check out Far From the Madding Crowd because it was a novel Hardy wrote basically to make money and to be accepted in the literary world. And he did that by constructing a very kind of comedic but beautiful narrative. It's very funny as well as very beautiful, very, very beautiful descriptions of the landscape and kind of the romance is, yeah, it's a wonderful book to read. So after he wrote Far From the Madding Crowd, Hardy made so much money because what was going on during this period is you would be writing books, but you would also be serializing them, kind of like, I don't know, do we still watch serials? Is Netflix like, are they series that we watch? You get episodes. That's what Thomas Hardy kind of, and that was going on in the middle of the Victorian period. They moved away from sending out novels straight away. They'd send out chapters to certain periodicals and they'd serialize them. For instance, Tess of the D'Urbervilles was first published in a serial newspaper called The Graphic. And every month or so, or every week or so, you'd get a couple of chapters released. And Hardy would make tons of money from serializing his novels and then publishing them in volume form. So he made a lot of money from Far From the Madding Crowd. And this basically enabled him to have some freedom to create what he wanted. If you recall back when I was talking about Emily Bronte was writing magnificent poetry, but she was writing it for herself. She wasn't writing it to make money. She was writing it because that's what she did. She created stuff. She couldn't survive by doing that. She had to try and write a novel that would make her some money. So she had to go at Wuthering Heights and it kind of worked historically speaking, but economically speaking at the time, it didn't work. But after Hardy made money from Far From the Madding Crowd, he then had time to write novels that he thought would actually be considered literature, would provoke people into kind of thinking about the world and maybe changing the world. And you definitely see that with his later novels. He dies in 1928, so we're deep into the modern period here. We're deep into the 20th century. He lived through the First World War, which of course we can't say about of any of the other authors we looked at. He died very famously, unlike Emily Bronte, who kind of gets buried way out in the middle of Yorkshire. His ashes, Hardy's ashes, are interred at Westminster Abbey. Apparently, someone almost tripped over when they were like carrying the coffin down there to bury him. What's Hardy kind of known for now is a set of 6 novels called the Wessex novels. And we're looking at one, Tess of the D'Urbervilles, but there are 6 others. Alana, have you still got your hand up? And I kind of, have you read any of the other
sorry.
ones? No, I might just ask you because you read Tess. Have you had a look at any of the others?
No, I haven't, not so far.
Well, definitely worth checking out. If you like Tess and you like Far From the Madding Crowd, I'd suggest The Woodlanders. I'd also suggest Judith the Obscure. The novels progressively get more antagonistic towards society as they go along. Under the Greenwood Tree, I absolutely hate that novel. It's just about these yokels that live in the English countryside and speak a kind of curious English hillbilly. I can't stand it. Far From the Madding Crowd, definitely worth reading. The Mayor of Casterbridge, it's very long and kind of a bit long-winded, to be honest. The Woodlanders is very beautiful. It's got so much moss and fungi and this aristocratic woman who's a total parasite who lives off all the poor. I mean, this is a woman who, if she saw Caitlyn's hair, she'd try and buy it off her. And then if Caitlyn refused to sell it, she'd get someone to come into her cottage and evict her. And then she'd like get someone to come along and cut her hair off after Caitlyn died because she couldn't have anywhere to live. That's how parasitic the female aristocrat is in the Woodlanders. Iconic. So Hardy was a professional writer, and that's another thing to mention. Although Austen could perhaps be considered a professional writer, but I don't think that's quite right. Emily Bronte wasn't a professional writer. By the time we get to Thomas Hardy, you arrive at a professional writer. This is someone who can live off solely what they're writing and live really well, kind of very, very rich. Hardy's Wessex novels are all set in this little mythical, almost pseudo-realistic realm called the Wessex of England. And this kind of ties into Amber's kind of mentioning what's going on with all the paganism. A lot of the geography here kind of is all set up to represent a Britain even before the Romans came, before the Normans colonized Britain. Long ago, there were these kind of true British people living there. Did anyone get a copy of Tess and they saw this map on the inside? Olivia?
Yeah.
Has it been helpful at all?
Honestly, can't say that I really looked at it.
Anyone else using the map as they're reading along? Has anyone seen maps in novels they read? Does Lord of the Rings have a map?
I think Game of Thrones does, doesn't it?
Does Game of Thrones have a map?
Or the Song of Ice or whatever it's actually called.
Yeah, I think maps are really cool, and I think Hardy did a lot to kind of institute them in literature. What I definitely would recommend, I think I've got the map on Collaborate. As you read Tess, you can follow her around on the map. You can kind of, I don't know, if you're waiting for your, we've got friends, and I think you can share things on your mobile phone so you know where each other are. Well, you can do this with Tess. You can follow her around, which is probably a good thing. I do think kind of keeping your eye on where your friends are is for safety purposes as well. And it's good to follow Tess around as she moves. But all of the Wessex novels are all set in this area, and often you can follow Tess as she walks past Jude the Obscure as he comes through. So the whole narrative, 6 volumes, they're all intersecting and connected. It's this wonderful little universe that Thomas Hardy's created, which we haven't really seen in the other novels. In terms of the context to Tess of the D'Urbervilles, we're starting to move towards to what you'd call the 20th century, the world of industrial modernity. Hardy's novels speak to and from within a world of increased modernization, urbanization, transportation, education, population. Everything's kind of booming during Hardy's period, which we don't really see in Austen's world to a certain extent, and definitely not in Emily Bronte's world. This is strange, though, because Hardy's kind of writing in a period of tremendous industrial and modernization, but most of his popular worlds are about non-industrial rural communities untouched by modernization. Does anyone want to take a guess why people might be interested in reading about, rustics milking cows in beautiful landscapes?
Would it be like people who are trying to escape the city life?
Yeah, I think like it's the same reason why we go on kind of cottage tours and things and escape to the country. When you get kind of urbanization and modernization, people become very nostalgic for this rural pastoral past that's somewhat lost. So I kind of think that Hardy's when you read Hardy's literature and you see how he survived and was successful, he plays upon what contemporary society doesn't have, what they desire, which is this longing for this rural utopia it probably wasn't a utopia that is long gone. I think also there's definitely a changed context as we move forward into the late Victorian period. Hardy's kind of writing kind of as feminism is really starting to become explicitly mobilized. I noticed that a lot of you, when you talked about Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, read Elizabeth Bennet in the light of feminism, which is perfectly fine in a way. But feminism, the word itself, I think some French guy invented it in the 1830s. Correct me if I'm wrong. There was definitely proto-feminism going on there in terms of Mary Wollstonecraft, of course. But when you get to the 1860s and the 1870s, you have huge movements like suffragettism kicking off. You have kind of women kind of saying, you know, I'm talking about women's rights right now. I'm talking about kind of a female-centered view of the world. And you get what's called not the woman question, not the woman problem, but you get this identity kind of called the new woman, which you definitely see in Thomas Hardy's literature. Bathsheba Everdeen is a new woman. By new woman, I mean you don't see anyone like her beforehand. She owns her own farm. She wants to run her own farm. She wants to kind of boss the men around and make sure they're not doing anything wrong. And she's also confident, and she's also educated, and she kind of is very courageous. The new woman, to give you a definition, was a generalized phrase describing an economically independent woman who stood socially, politically, and educationally equal among men. It was a topic of much concern, debate in both Britain and the United States in the late 19th century. And I think if you do get the time to read Far From the Madding Crowd or even watch the adaptation, there's a wonderful scene where Farmer Boldwood refuses to engage in any economic business with Bathsheba Everdeen in the marketplace in the marketplace in Far From the Madding Crowd, because even though there was this so-called new woman, a lot of men during the period and a lot of women as well didn't like the idea of the new woman. But nonetheless, we are kind of progressing. We moved from a period when we looked at Pride and Prejudice where kind of things were being inferred, things were being discussed. Elizabeth was kind of pointing out, you know, Mr. Darcy, you've got some serious high expectations when it comes to femininity. Then we get to Emily Bronte's world, and you've got clearly a whole lot going on there in terms of feminism, but it's often not kind of directly kind of represented. Now we get to Hardy's world, and kind of you get to the 1890s, and things are starting to change. Things are starting to move ahead. Another big social context that changes Thomas Hardy's novels in a very big way was the publication of Charles Darwin's The Origin of Species in 1859. Reason why it's kind of important to mention Charles Darwin in the light of Thomas Hardy is because The Origin of Species drastically, significantly altered the way people saw themselves spiritually, environmentally, teleologically in terms of their purpose in the universe, but also echologically in terms of where they fit into the environment. So on the one hand, the theory of natural selection, of course, describes species, including humans, as the product of random and often violent aberrations beneficial in the struggle to survive in a particular environment. And you definitely see this in Hardy's fiction. Often it's just random bad luck. Often Tess just has just serious bad luck falls upon her. Or often often the problem is the issue of Tess's good luck turns out to be her bad luck, in that she's quite kind of desirable by all these hideous men, and the issue of the drive for sexual reproduction comes to contaminate and control the narrative. And that was very central to natural selection, of course, was the whole idea of natural selection is that we are here to reproduce our species, and that's the primary driving force. It's not really about morality. Connected to natural selection, you have this idea of sexual selection, which sought to describe both the origins of sexual coercion in nature as well as sexual agency in nature. So it's very interesting if you look at the history of sexual selection when it comes about during the period, because it was invented by men, and men thought that nature is kind of red in tooth and claw, and therefore a lot of the males in the species are clearly by nature sexually coercive, and because it's natural, it therefore shouldn't be kind of stopped. But at the same time, there was clearly a lot of arguments about, hey, clearly the female of the species also has a lot of preference when it comes to natural selection and sexual selection. This is all written about in a wonderful book by Gillian Beer, that bigwig professor I mentioned at the very beginning of this unit when I talked about all literature being either about the desire to transcend reality or the desire to represent it. She wrote a book called Darwin's Plots, in which she kind of suggests that what Darwinism did in a way was change the whole entire narrative structure about the way we thought of ourselves in the world. And we definitely see this to a certain extent, I would say, in a lot of Thomas Hardy's literature. It often seems to be driven by kind of biological imperatives. Sexual selection is also important to mention in terms of the romance, because sexual selection undermined the Victorian ideal of feminine passivity. If you look at sexual selection in nature, you often find that the majority of the time, the female is by far the more important kind of a partner in these relationships, and they usually have all the agency, particularly in invertebrates like bees. If anyone knows anything about bees, like, and you're male, you get a bit scared because the females basically just kill the males, very much like in spiders. Yeah, there's like a total matriarchy in the world of honeybees. They basically kill them all en masse if they fail to perform sexually. And you know, the thing about the drone bees, they die during sex. So they have this tremendous orgasm and then they explode and it's all over. Must be the best way to die for a drone bee. And they were discovering this at that time. They were discovering basically, and this comes into play with this issue of patriarchy in the romance novel, they were discovering that males are useless. Like at a very fundamental biological level, males are not so important. What sexual selection also drew attention to was the plurality of sexual arrangements outside of this big thing called heteronormative monogamy, which has, of course, been driving Elizabeth. It's been driving Heathcliff to fall in love with Kathy. So you kind of, you have sexual selection making people think about what's going on in nature, but also what's going on in culture. And one thing sexual selection definitely does is it just foregrounds, and I do think this is important to reading Tess, it foregrounds how weird and how bizarre and how perhaps unnatural this patriarchal system of kind of culture is going on. Like, how did it get established? It clearly seems to be dysfunctional in so many ways. So sexual selection does a lot of work in making people think critically about the social organization of romance. Sorry, guys, I think I'm talking kind of at a very rapid fashion here. I'm almost through with kind of the context that I'm giving you. Another one related to natural selection was this idiom called naturalism, which is related to realism. But the difference in a nutshell is that naturalism is really driven by the ideas of natural selection. So suddenly Darwinism comes about and it creates a new paradigm for seeing the world. And people start to represent the world realistically, but driven by those modes of representation tied to sexual selection and naturalism, tied to natural selection. So you have kind of realism being shaped and changed by naturalism. Has anyone done working class writing and maybe has read some Emile Zola? Amber? Yeah, Emile Zola is kind of one of my favorite writers. I mean, kind of there's a lot of problems with Emile Zola, but like a contemporary such as George Eliot, a very wonderful Victorian novelist who I'd like to teach a novel on at some time in my life. very much interested in using the ideas of natural selection and sexual selection to set up scenarios to create new narratives. So naturalism could be something that may interest you when you come to think about how realism is working in Tess of the D'Urbervilles. I do want to talk about the anthropology of the romance, because Amber did mention and ask a question about what's going on kind of in terms of the various mythical or religious systems at play in Tess of the D'Urbervilles. One way I can do this is by kind of contextualizing kind of one of the big books written during this period in 1890 was Sir James Fraser's The Golden Bow, which is a massive tome. I think it's 8 or 9 volumes in length, although you can get a redacted version, which was kind of a pioneering work of mythology, but also mythography, sorry, not just mythology, but also an attempt to kind of understand the way Western societies, because during the Enlightenment, like a lot of Europeans were going around colonizing the world and saying, look at these people's curious beliefs. Aren't they so kind of naive and childish? They think if they can, you know, do a bit of voodoo, they'll achieve an end. When you get to the 1890s, a writer like Sir James Fraser is applying an anthropological lens to his own society and looking at all of the curious behaviors and rituals that are going on. Often people don't even know they're doing them. So Hardy was writing during a period when customs, rites, rituals, and myths in human society, particularly his own society, were becoming subject to scientific analysis. People were thinking about mythology as a type of science that you could structurally understand. In The Golden Bow, Sir James Fraser basically argued that the earliest religions grew out of a belief in magic to be structured around fertility cults that engaged in rituals identifiable via an analysis of myth, based on a cyclical inauguration and sacrifice of something to ensure seasonal revitalization. I almost always feel by the time I get to this slide, and at this time in the unit, I'm kind of confusing a lot of people. But I do think this is somewhat important to thinking about the relationship between tragedy and human sacrifice, because those of you, when you get to the end of Tess, if you watch the adaptation or read the novel, you will see that Tess is kind of placed upon an altar and sacrificed up to the world. So Hardy seems to be playing with contemporary ideas about primitive belief systems in his own culture in order to elicit some kind of response, perhaps from the anthropological community, or to get people thinking about their own community in terms of how it might be somewhat kind of ritualistic. Romance itself, and this is important because we are looking at romance and how it relates to realism, came by Fraser to be exposed as a type of ritual entailing a good deal of magic. Now I'm mentioning magic and you're probably going, what on earth am I going on about? But you might recall that romance, when we kind of went back to its origins, was associated with the medieval. It was also associated with magical narratives, that is, narratives that magically, often fictively, can resolve social problems and social issues with a wave of the narrative hand. In comes Darcy with his 10,000 a year to save the day. So Fraser studied magic to expose a type of thinking present in culture and narrative structures more broadly. Often a lot of rituals are predicated on this idea that you go through a stage in which you kind of, for instance, here we see a queen knighting someone. Of course, he enters into that ritual not a knight, and then she magically knights him, and he arises as kind of a more powerful kind of knighted person. Anyone remember the story of Excalibur? Of course, there's this famous sword stuck in a rock, and only the king can rip it out. And of course, the king comes along to rip it out. But if you remember our story, of course, of the toad who gets kissed by the chick and turned into the prince, and they all live happily ever after, hopefully you can see how romance itself may be tied to certain ritualistic practices that use magic to magically resolve the world. Tied to Fraser's anthropology of romance, he further showed that magic was supplanted by religions, magical belief systems, and I think maybe you could think euphemistically about magical belief systems being tied to paganism, although I don't want to put paganism in a pejorative box. Nevertheless, did seem to kind of be tied to that. Magic, according to Fraser, kind of progressively got supplanted by institutions known as religions that were founded on a need to propitiate a higher deity through sacrifice. Often the sacrifice, of course, of a poor little animal would get kind of cut up in a lot of Roman sacrifice kind of behaviors. But of course, there were, of course, forms of human sacrifice. If you go back far enough, I think in a lot of the early stories in the Bible, for instance, I believe God, Yahweh, asked Abraham to sacrifice his firstborn son, Isaac. And if people who contextualize that narrative, they often go, there were actually religious kind of people during the period, Phoenicians and people living on the borders, who would often sacrifice children to Baal, their god, for a variety of reasons, usually because they wanted to bribe the god into giving him some kind of benefit. Often a lot of human sacrifices are about to ensure that the grain grows. So in Tess, of course, Tess and the White Maidens appear at the very beginning, and they do a dance, and it's hoped that the dance will bring about the crops, and the spring and the harvest will be good. You may recall, I don't know, it's a very deep reading of Pride and Prejudice, but Pride and Prejudice does follow this cyclical fashion. I think it begins at the start of winter and pretty much ends very close to winter. Likewise, Tess does as well. Tess has this cyclical fashion. It follows a very kind of seasonal calendar, and often a lot of the plotting of women's fates seems to be kind of positioned, particularly when they get married or when something happens to them, at a sacrificial moment within that narrative structure. You may say that Wuthering Heights doesn't follow that structure, and it kind of doesn't, but in a way it does, because what it does is it extends the cyclical process out, and it's not so much, it begins in winter and ends in winter. It begins with one generation and ends with the new generation. What kind of happens though in Tess, I think, is that, and what Fraser showed was that ritualistic practices like magic, but also romance, it exposed them as a type of primitive magic or false consciousness. So does magic actually work? I don't want to kind of, I'm not asking a Joseph question. I'm not trying to draw out a witch here. Does magic work? Can anyone come up with a spell to make me kind of, richer and more intelligent and I give more captivating talks? Does magic work? Or is this just such a question? It doesn't, I'm not gonna kind of respect that question with an answer.
I think oh, sorry, I was just gonna say, I think it's if you believe it does, then it does. Like, I know that's like a bit of a not really an answer to your question, but that's my answer, I guess.
No, I think that's Freud's answer as well, Olivia. It's definitely what Freud said as well. It's a form of wish fulfillment, right?
Yeah, I don't think
I hope
there's
it
any
works.
harm.
Yeah, I hope it works. And we all have rituals. For instance, some people smoke because it makes them less stressed. And it's often they believe it makes them less stressed. And because they think it does that, it actually works. Some people think they'll drink coffee like me in the morning and I'll get over waking up at 3 a.m. And if I drink more coffee, I'll be able to stay awake until now. And it worked, it was a ritual, and the caffeine helped me, but it also helped me believe in it. Magic works as a form of wish fulfillment, but it doesn't really work. And maybe I'll ask this as a question and then we'll have a break. how does this play out like in Tess? What does Tess discover about herself at the beginning of the novel? What is she told? What's the big revelation about poor Tess d'Urberville and her family?
But they're not actually. That's the revelation.
I kind of I want to probe this. So I'm going to stop the share because Caitlin mentions that they're from a rich family. Amber mentions, but they're not actually from a rich family. What do you mean by that?
Isn't it that it's a bit convoluted, but I'm pretty sure they assumed that somewhat like this random guy in like the first chapter comes up and tells them that their last name Derbyshire
Yep.
is actually like derived from D'Urbervilles, and so they're like distantly related and they can claim what is theirs from the D'Urbervilles, but the D'Urberville name is just that. It's just a name. It's like a figurative kind of, like you would say the royal family, like last name. So they go to try and claim this money and there is no money. It's just like this figure. I think is that right?
Yeah, there's no right or wrong here. That's a great reading of it in the sense that basically John d'Urberville, the father, who's always, did anyone not like John d'Urberville? Did anyone feel sympathy for him because he's got a bad heart?
Nah, he was kind of like embarrassing. I don't know.
Yeah,
He gave me like embarrassing feeling.
Did anyone see an affinity between him and Mr. Bennet? And you could just erase it in terms of one's from a different class to the other?
Yeah, they're both average fathers that were pretty absent and pretty shit.
Yeah, there is a moment where Tess, when she leaves to go to Alec d'Urberville's mansion, and the mother's worried about maybe she sent her daughter off to the devil, and the father's snoring, and he's like, well, you should have thought about that before you did that. And yeah, Ren's he was very, very, very annoying. Of course, he gets drunk all the time. And as soon as he finds out, he gets told that, and it's true, it is true, that Tess d'Urberville is of aristocratic origins. She can be traced back. The antiquary on the horse points out, you are an aristocrat, but it doesn't mean anything. She discovers this romance about her history. Has anyone done a genealogy and discovered something interesting about where they come from?
Yeah, my grandma is huge into it. She's in the genealogical society and everything.
Oh, really?
And she traced our family back to Ireland and to some, like a lord there or something similar to that. So, but that was like centuries ago.
That's an interesting kind of point. Back to a lord. Does anyone else know much about their heritage in terms of genealogy going back? Going back to Scotland, anyone else have some heritage like equivalent to Tess, going back to the the Norman conquest perhaps, or back further? Remember Heathcliff? Who knows? But your father may have been Emperor of China and your mother Princess of India. I'm curious because what happens in Tess is, of course, is the discovery of her heritage, is it a positive thing? Or does this discovery of this romance of her kind of lineage, does it wreak havoc on her life? Could you describe it perhaps as a curse?
100%. Because the way I saw it, like, I haven't finished reading, but I kind of know what happens in the novel. But I think when the family found out that they're of like royal lineage or whatever it may be, it was like a catalyst for her to have all these unfortunate events. And I'm just like, damn, bitch, you should have just minded your business. While her dad, that's why I don't like the dad, because he's just like, oh my god, we're
Yeah.
rich.
Yeah, and that's
Sorry guys, sorry.
well, no, that was a great way of putting it. And I think Tess does try to mind her business, right? Does she, Renz? Does she she doesn't really want to do anything with it, does she?
No, she definitely like wants no part of it, but she's like, sorry guys, I killed a horse. Like, I've got to make it up to you somehow. I'm just like, that, well, girl, you don't need to be that selfless, but I get it. It's hard times.
Yeah, I do think there's a lot of weird stuff going on in terms of romance, because the horse's name is, of course, Prince. And the prince dies, it gets jousted in the heart in a very arbitrary way. She's on the cart with Abraham and she's fallen asleep because because her drunk father is too lazy to take the beehives to market. That's what happens. And poor Tess is the only kind of cognizant adult in the family. But the romance of aristocratic heritage definitely saturates the father and the mother, and they start scheming and they think, oh, now we can create this new narrative, this new plot for Tess. She's going to go and meet a handsome gentleman named Alec Durbeyfield, and they're going to fall in love. And they're going to get married, and he's got a diamond ring, which he loves kind of flashing, and that's going to recover the family's that's how it's going to recover the family's kind of heritage, but it doesn't happen at all. We might take a break there for 10 minutes. When we come back, we're going to read an essay by Thomas Hardy and look at kind of what Thomas Hardy is writing about in terms of kind of what he would like to represent in his novels, because as we move towards looking at kind of the problems in Tess on Wednesday next week, we might want to get some context into what could be represented during this period and what could be censored somewhat. So let's have a 10-minute break. So what's the time now? 7:26. Let's come back at 7:36. And I will chuck in the chat the reading. It's only a short reading. It'll maybe be 10 minutes. I actually, my last name's Harrington. Any of you notice in Pride and Prejudice, there's actually a few characters called Harrington. But to Amber's point, what actually happened with my family is we were originally from Ireland, I guess. We don't really know too much. But what happened is when Oliver Cromwell colonized large swathes of Ireland and enslaved the occupants, they gave the people who were enslaved the last name of the lord that colonized that area. And that was Lord Harrington from Rutland in central Britain. So my last name is essentially the name of an aristocratic lord who enslaved my ancestors. So there you have it. But you know, the funny thing is you often run into Harringtons and you kind of glare at them and go, which Harringtons are you? Because some Harringtons are the British Harringtons and some Harringtons are the enslaved Irish Harringtons. Some are the quality and some are the chaff, I guess. Ancient Harrington beef. Most definitely. Most definitely. Yeah. A lot of people from Denmark have Harrison, which is very similar to Harrington. Ten-minute break. Back at 7:36. Hmm. That was good, Caitlin. It was an adventure. It was hard to stay awake during the day between now and then. But yeah, as I was explaining to everyone, kind of the beginning of the class, my sister works as a florist, so I really wanted to go. She needed help, but it's like a giant flower market at the airport, so all the flowers get sent in, and you get to see like just all the varieties of flowers you can access. But then slowly you see where they go and how they slowly kind of break down in terms of you get these big clumps of flowers. They've got all the bushes and leaves on them. Some are still a part of a plant, and then someone buys them and strips them down, and then someone in Melbourne will put them in a bouquet, and then someone will buy them and they go into someone's house. I really feel sorry for the flowers. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, Ryan's mentioned in the chat he went to a flower festival. The floats can be really cool. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I guess the big thing was you just see how everything becomes a commodity, even like flowers, which kind of I guess that's the nature of capitalism, that everything becomes a commodity. And we kind of know that, but when you experience it, it's just, I don't know, it's a bit disturbing. I like to see the flowers on the plants. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's like someone I was telling this to during the day. They said, "Oh, you got to see how the sausage is made," which I kind of did. But so many flowers, so many beautiful flowers, and it's such a big industry. Like you don't realize how big economics is until you go and see where all the flowers come from. Ah, yeah, yeah. They're more expensive if they're short lived, and but also if they're very delicate and precious. So kind of yeah, there's a variety of kind of impacts that kind of yeah kind of drive flower markets. But it was an experience. My sister wants me to do it more often, and I keep trying to nicely say it's not so fun getting up at 3. Um, hmm. Yeah. Hmm. Ah, ah. Well, we should really reconvene back. Sometimes I like giving 15-minute breaks, but for some reason I've set it at 10 for romance and realism. But in a way, you're kind of going to have a break from listening to me talking, which will be good. Um, uh, can you guys see in the chat? I've kind of chucked in a little. Hold on, Ryan asked, did you ever see the ads for Eternal Roses? I don't know. I'm not sure what Ryan's talking about here. I've never seen the ads for Eternal Roses. Are they Eternal Roses? Do they live forever? Speaking of roses, there's a really creepy scene. Did anyone notice it at the beginning of Tess where Alec dresses her up with all the roses?
Yeah.
And Camille's got thumbs up. And then everything he says is so slimy. He's like a toad rat or something. I don't know how to describe him. I like toads. I actually like rats as well. All animals are lovable, but when you combine them in the person of Alec d'Urberville, they get a bit slimy. He dresses her up with all these posies and roses, and then he cuts her, doesn't he? Does he cut her somewhere? It is very specific, but I'm pretty sure like roses have thorns, as I learnt this morning when I had to rip off all the leaves on these stupid roses. I don't know. And
Is it on her cheek that he cuts her? Because I noticed that she had like a little scar, but I didn't pay attention if it was there before that scene though.
yeah, it might have been on her cheek or on her chest, but and he says, there, my beauty. Beauty has its price. The rose has its thorn. It's just he's I don't know, like can anyone think of a more creepier character in the history of literature? There probably is. There'd have to be.
I reckon Mr. Collins was pretty creepy in like the 2005 adaptation of Pride and Prejudice. You know that scene where they're trying to ballroom dance and he's like in her face just staring at her? Oh my gosh, that was horrifying. That was so good.
Yeah, it's creepy, but it's comic at the same time, isn't it? Collins is safe in the sense that he's a joke and can be controlled, whereas Alec seems to have all the power and like he's conversing with a 16-year-old girl. That it gets totally creepy there. Whereas, yeah, Collins could be very, very creepy if he wasn't such a fool. I'm thinking there'd have to be some more creepier characters in the history of literature. Has anyone seen Cape Fear with Robert De Niro? That's a film worth seeing, Cape Fear. He's very, very creepy. We might reconvene. My Word doc got pushed up, but what I'd like you guys to do is might quickly share screen. And bring this back up. Hopefully you can all see in the chat, I've chucked on a Word document. It's from an 1890 essay by Thomas Hardy. He wrote an essay just like you guys are going to write your long essays soon. I want to ask you guys to read this essay. It's not very long, but I think I'll give you 20 to 25 minutes. To give you some context, Hardy was, as I mentioned before, writing during the heyday of serialization. After serialization, the novel would then be published in set volumes, purchasable from a bookseller, or borrowed from a subscription or circulating library, kind of the equivalent to Netflix or Blockbuster Video. Blockbuster Video is no longer around, right? That's like way gone. I think South Park had an episode where it's like Blockbuster is that's the Shining type kind of ghost haunted video store. The big problem in terms of what Hardy faced, because Thomas Hardy wanted to write about issues that need to be kind of dealt with socially and culturally, the lending libraries, Moody's lending library, which was kind of the Netflix of the day, would not accept immoral literature. And whatever like was deemed immoral, it might have some sexual kind of allusions in it, and that would be branded immoral. And if you were not to redact or take that out, they wouldn't publish it at all. They operated like a standard G rating, maybe a PG, but nothing above like an MA15 or an R-rated kind of rating. The general motto during the time of the Cornhill magazine, which Hardy got his first major success published in, was "Thou shalt not shock a young lady." And if anyone has seen or read Far From the Madding Crowd, there is a very erotic scene in Far From the Madding Crowd with Troy, the villainous redcoat, who kind of uses his sword to kind of swipe at Bathsheba in a very seductive fashion. But Hardy nonetheless could only represent certain kind of erotics to do with courtship by sublimating them in a similar way to Emily Bronte. So we're talking about a time when censorship's kind of quite prevalent. Hardy was very much interested in controversial themes, hostile to monogamy, because he thought it was kind of very problematic. A lot of his novels deal with issues to do with drug and alcohol abuse. As you would have seen, as you will see as you keep reading through Tess, kind of Hardy was interested in sexual values, sexual hypocrisy, sexual abuse, particularly this thing called the double standard, which you see in particularly Angel Clare in Tess of the D'Urbervilles. So Hardy was trying to kind of represent kind of adult issues in a world that would only publish G stuff. What I want you guys to do is spend 20 minutes reading Candor in English fiction. And as you do so, try to answer these questions if you can. What does Hardy see? I'll leave the PowerPoint on so you don't need to write these down. What does Hardy see as the main problem with the literary industry and the way literature is being published? Big question number one, but it's definitely in there. How might not being able to represent romance realistically shape lived experience? So is Hardy saying anything about the way romance may be very problematic because it's not actually dealing with human relationships, particularly romantic relationships? Does Hardy propose any way of solving the issues of censorship? Are these issues still relevant today? Or is censorship a historical phenomenon? So we've got a ton of questions here. Try at least to answer one of them so we can kind of get a diversity of answers when we come back. The time is now 7:46. Let's come back at maybe 7:10. 7:10, you should have enough time to read that short article and answer some of these questions. I'm actually looking forward to coming back face to face because I'll be able to bribe you with lollies and stuff. I find kind of having face to face works well because you can promise treats at the end of these tasks and it gives an incentive. Whereas separation from the Zoom screen, I have nothing to offer you but sweetness and light. So please start reading that and I'll read it myself. If I can I? Pretty sure I can. No, I can't. I've got to keep that up there. Yeah, it's up in the chat. You'll find it if you scroll back up in the chat. And if you can't find it, I can put it in there again. Yeah, okay. I just chucked it in again. Man. Sorry to break the silence. How are we going? Did we get through it or still a couple more minutes? Has anyone not finished reading? I'm a slow reader myself. Has anyone fallen asleep? Did Hardy put you to sleep with his candor and English fiction? Olivia, did you get through it?
Oh, look, I'm pretty close to falling asleep. I don't really, he was just going on a lot of tangents, I feel.
Kathleen, did you find it a bit of a hard read?
Yeah.
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 I'm hoping you can see past some of his allusions to people like Auguste de Comte and certain medieval narratives and whatnot. Does anyone want to take a crack at the first question? What Hardy might see as the main problem with the literary industry and the way it's operating in this period, 1890. This is the year before Tess of the D'Urbervilles was published and serialized.
From what I understand, I think he had a problem with serialization. I think.
Yeah, how
Or I
so?
might have- it seems like he didn't like how hang on, so I totally lost it. I was just looking at it.
That's all right. Yeah, I feel like everyone's pretty exhausted on Thursday night. Serialization was definitely central. Was someone about to jump in just before Lance?
Yeah, I don't know if you guys can hear me.
Yep, can hear you.
Okay,
Camille.
cool. I think he was maybe alluding to this idea of censorship and like we're publishing like based on what we think is okay to publish rather than actually saying what we want to say as authors. So I think he's saying, yeah, that's not so good.
Yeah, he says the magazine in particular and the circulating library, and this is probably going to what Lance may have highlighted, in general do not foster the growth of the novel which reflects and reveals life. They directly tend to exterminate it by monopolizing all literary space. So on the one hand, the publishing industry has taken over all of the places you can produce literature, and it's policing what can be published. Does he say anything further to that? Is it distortive? Think about this unit being about romance and realism. Is he saying that people are being prevented from realistically representing the world?
That's what I took away from it.
Who is that? I can't see you. Was that?
That was me, Olivia.
Olivia. Yeah. I think he says it kind of repeatedly throughout there. What this practically amounts to is that the patrons of literature no longer peers with a taste, acting under the censorship of prudery, rigorously exclude from the pages they regulate subjects that have been made by general approval of the best judges, the basis of the finest imaginative compositions since literature rose to the dignity of an art. Does Hardy kind of suggest this is a question that's not on the questions, that maybe some forms of literature kind of would be banned if they weren't classified as great literature at the time?
Do you mean when he was talking about Shakespeare, like certain
Yeah.
ones? Yeah.
Do you think that's true? Like for the period, in the sense that once something's given the capital L as like being this is great literature, suddenly you're allowed to kind of talk about certain things. Do you think Othello, Hamlet, and Antony and Cleopatra, if they were converted, I think this is the key issue here, if they were converted into a modern work of realism, would not kind of pass censorship. Would that happen? I don't know. It's ambiguous. One of my favorite poems is by a poet called Edmund Spenser, and it's called The Fairy Queen. And I'm telling you, this poem was written in the 16th century. Yeah, pretty sure late 16th century. And there's some passages in this poem that are, let's just say, they're extraordinarily raunchy, extraordinarily kind of, yeah, they're very, very kind of wonderful and beautiful, but they're kind of incredibly kind of, they're just really, really sexy. And you would think that kind of the only reason why we're allowed to read that today and not kind of describe it in a certain way is because it's kind of labeled literature and it's kind of past approval. Does Hardy kind of propose any ways of solving this issue of censorship, the dictatorship of the kind of prudes who control the circulating libraries?
I think he says something about instead of lending out books in a library system, perhaps selling them or making magazines that are adult only.
Yeah, which sounds weird, right?
Yeah.
I think like we have an idea of like what an adult kind of only book is, but he's not talking about that, is he? He's not talking about pornography, right? Or is he? I don't know. I think I know, but I'm open to kind of alternate readings of this essay. Yeah, it could be, but yeah, I would kind of side on the side of because if you get the time to read Lady Chatterley's Lover, which of course was banned kind of for the good deal of the 20th century, it does depict sexual relations, but you guys are all adults and you've all had access to the television. I'm sure you've sat down once with your parents and something really awkward's happened. Maybe you were watching a film and suddenly there was. Yeah, it's a very awkward experience. And I think Hardy's kind of talking about this in a way when he mentions rather bizarrely that often the kids in the family have more progressive views than the parents. Because the kids are more open to social change and new ideas, where parents tend to be a bit conservative and paternalistic. So in a way, to kind of extend on Jamie's thinking, he does suggest certain ways of doing that. Having, for instance, adult-only books, but he also suggests perhaps having ratings so people know what they're going to read. Has that kind of happened? Do we now kind of have a better system in place to ensure that we're watching appropriate things at the appropriate age? Yeah, it is, but I do want to ask because I often find that this is an ethical issue in teaching Tess of the D'Urbervilles, and we'll be looking at Lady Chatterley's Lover. I often find that Lady Chatterley's Lover is a less confronting book to read compared to Tess of the D'Urbervilles. And I wanted to ask, some of you guys, I think Amber decided not to watch Tess because it was made by Roman Polanski. Did anyone watch it and see what rating it was? What rating do you think Tess of the D'Urbervilles is?
Didn't you say it was MA 15 plus?
Oh, did I give you the answer?
Yeah.
God.
Sorry.
I
I thought you knew that you did that and you were just asking us to like clarify. Sorry.
No. Does anyone think that maybe it should be Do you think MA 15 plus is appropriate? Hmm. Yeah, that's a really yes. No, I think that's a really interesting point, Caitlin, because some might side on this should be rated higher, but at the same time, it's dealing in themes that may be good for kids growing up, particularly adolescents as they mature, something to watch with parents and kind of confront together because it doesn't actually depict certain things, but nonetheless, it's something that you can watch probably with your kids as a group, kind of, and get more meaning out of it than a lot of other films. I do nonetheless find it kind of a bit strange in terms of how it's rated, and I think one of the reasons why it's rated the way it's rated is because it's considered literature. Even though it's an adaptation of literature. Final question. Do we still have issues of censorship today? Is censorship still a big thing? Is it? Sarisha, you're nodding? I think you're nodding. You may not be nodding.
Yes, I am. I was thinking it's a big issue even today. Like some of the films, I didn't remember any example just at this point of moment, but I read in a news article, some director said the censorship issue is too much. So even though my film doesn't have any irrelevant scenes, yet they're rated as MA, I think 15 plus.
Yeah.
So it just got like, he lost a lot of money with that because of that censorship. I think it's a big issue.
Yeah, yeah, it is, and people do lose a lot of money because they're restricted from entering certain markets, and that was definitely the case with Thomas Hardy. He couldn't do what he wanted to do and tell the stories he wanted to tell because he was being told to redact and take out what was deemed inappropriate. Lance, depends on who you're asking.
That was just a dig at certain types of people online, who say like awful things and then get banned on social media and then cry about censorship. But it's just kind of a thing.
Yeah, that is a big thing, and that's probably a more relevant thing in terms of like where we're at today in terms of what is it called, cancel culture. Is this what we're talking about here?
Yeah, it was just a little bit.
What is cancel culture? Is that like a social form of censorship that is kind of by the group?
Yeah.
Is it a vexed issue? Is that a stupid question, Chris? Like, of course it's a vexed issue. It's probably the most vexed issue. Renz says it's useful but can be toxic. What do you mean, Renz?
Okay. Let's try not go on a tangent. But with cancel culture lately, because we have so much access to information and we're aware of what's politically correct or something that's more extreme. But because of that, if someone says or does the wrong thing, everyone has a tendency to just cancel them. So like they're fully boycotted, no support whatsoever, which I understand, like there should be consequences to everyone's actions, but we also have to acknowledge that people can grow and change and they should still be held accountable, but to a certain degree where they're not fully ostracized from society.
Yes, yes. Yeah, I think there's probably degrees, right, of people that are kind of maybe playing upon social taboos and exploiting them at the detriment of others. But perhaps there's also people that may actually kind of make an error in kind of discourse, because we're not perfect when we speak, and often we don't speak correctly, and we have a lot of unconscious biases. That doesn't make it okay. But nonetheless, if you get called out and kind of you apologize. But I think perhaps, Renz, what you're getting at is that sometimes the person is completely kind of banished from the community.
Yeah, they can be like fully, like full on, just see you later, sister. Bye.
Yeah, I kind of think the dynamic there with cancel culture kind of is much more complicated than what Hardy's talking about here, because he's just talking about, I should be able to represent kind of social problems, for instance, like sexual assault, and not have it redacted out of my novel. But at the same time, and we'll look at this on Wednesday, it does tie into the politics of representation and the question, and I think this is very integral to cancel culture, the question of who has the right to represent whom and how. And there is a bit of a question about Hardy's representation of Tess. Did anyone kind of, I know we kind of generally had the consensus that Alex is a bit of an odious toad rat man who's creepy and kind of is disturbing. Did anyone find Hardy's portrayal of Tess in areas a little problematic or questionable? It's a difficult question. I'm thinking like the subtitle of Tess of the D'Urbervilles is A Pure Woman, which Hardy really defended. And he did it intentionally, but I think there could be, and we'll look at this when we closely read a chapter on Wednesday, some issues to do with the way certain things get aestheticized, which kind of seem really, really problematic. I'm actually thinking it's 8:30 now. I was going to talk a little bit more about, one moment. I was going to talk a little bit more about are you guys back at this? Oh, you were always there, weren't you? I was going to talk about the fallen woman. I think I might leave that for the beginning of our next session, or I might send that video out, which is kind of, will tie into when we focus on aspects of romance and realism and the actual content of Tess. We've really talked about kind of the various contexts and the publishing context today to do with Tess, but our Wednesday session will look at kind of the content of Tess. But I'm thinking it's Thursday. We've done 2 sessions this week. I do find them to be quite grilling for you guys. So if you're happy to call it a night, I might be happy to call it a night as well. And we'll recommence, I know I've got to see you, Sarisha, and I think Lance wants to chat as well. But we'll take up Tess on Wednesday. Monday, of course, is your essay map presentations. So start working on them. And one thing I might mention just in closing is that it is just the beginning of your planning to write the essay. So it's just the start. So what we're looking at here is what I'm looking at is have you started to answer a question? Are you kind of looking at certain topics and sub-arguments that are going to help you write a good essay? So part of the whole process of doing these essay plan presentations is to make sure you're all on the right path to write a good essay. Do prepare and get ready and do them, but don't have an anxiety attack about them being not perfect. maybe I can ask it a question to me that students may be wanting to ask. You can, yes, present it as a PowerPoint presentation. You can also we'll just do a share screen and you can just do a run over saying, I've chosen question 8. I'm going to be arguing this. These are some of my sub-arguments. And I've also found these references here. And I do think you guys are all great primitive communists and you're not secretly kind of going to steal each other's stuff. The great thing about doing these presentations is Caitlin might be answering a question that Kathleen's answering, and Kathleen might have a really good article that may actually really help Caitlin, and you'll be able to share each other's ideas and exchange things by watching each other's presentations. So it'll be a good learning exercise, developing kind of our thinking going forward. Yeah, so I think we might end early tonight. Not because I don't have a lot more to talk about, but I'll have a lot more to talk about on Wednesday in terms of tests. Any questions? I feel like there's so little emotion in these black boxes with the names. The one thing I'm going to miss though is it's going to be very hard to start remembering everyone's name, because that's the good thing. One of the benefits of Zoom, right, is Kathleen, Camille, Ryan, Kayla. One of the hard things about like face-to-face is you've got to learn 30 people's names. It's not easy when you can't remember your key card pin. Jamie, there's no room for growth and learning from mistakes. Sorry, is this
I was talking about what Renz was saying about cancel culture.
Yeah. Is that the real problem, in the sense that kind of people don't really accept an apology, or they just want to kind of attack someone and kind of destroy them without thinking about the individual?
Yeah, I think it goes back to what we were saying with Pride and Prejudice and Mr. Wickham. It's very one-dimensional. You just think that person's evil and that's it. You've labeled them that and you don't see the dimensions of that person.
Yeah, that's a really good context there that I never would have thought of. Does Wickham get cancelled? I guess he does, doesn't he?
Kind of, yeah.
He can't play the venues at Longbourn. He's not really allowed around there because Mr. Bennett doesn't want to have anything to do with him. He's been totally cancelled. Yeah, but the good thing about Wickham though is he's not a real person. He's definitely not a real person. I'm cogent. I haven't, I'm not that psychotic. I know that Wickham's a fictional character. Any further questions? You can feel free to go. It's just I know a few people want to hang around and kind of ask some questions. Adios, amigos. Yeah, thanks, friends, for all your good comments today.
Thanks, Chris. Hi, everyone.
See ya.
Bye. Thanks for the good class.
See you, Kayla. Yeah, it's a bit, Lance, Sarisha, I know we've got to have a quick chat. Do you want to jump in a breakout room, Lance? Because I think you might want to talk about something to do with the assessment, perhaps?
Yeah, that'd be great. If you've got the time.
Yeah. I'll just create a little mini breakout room. I think I just need to create one, right? I've never done this before. So I can create, I think I need to create, let's create one. Yeah, let's do this. And it's probably not going to work, but